A maid starts working at a millionaire's mansion, but when she sees his adopted daughter, her world turns upside down. The girl reminds her of someone she lost long ago, a memory too painful to face. As the truth begins to unravel, the millionaire's reaction shocks everyone. What secret could bring a man like him to tears? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Helena Ruiz trembled as she stood before the towering iron gates of the Hart Mansion, a reclusive, self-made millionaire. Helena's hands trembled as she stood before the towering iron gates of the Hart Mansion. The morning sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn, making the enormous house look even more intimidating. She smoothed down her simple gray uniform and took a deep breath, clutching her small bag of cleaning supplies closer. "You can do this," she whispered to herself. "It's just another job." But it wasn't just another job. After years of moving from town to town, searching endlessly, Elena had finally settled in this quiet suburb. She needed stability now, even if her heart still ached with every passing day. The security guard checked her credentials and waved her through. Elena's sensible shoes crunched against the gravel driveway as she made her way to the service entrance. Mrs. Peterson, the head housekeeper, was waiting for her with a stern expression and perfectly pressed uniform. "Right on time, Ms. Ruiz," Mrs. Peterson said, checking her watch. "Let's go over your duties." The next hour was a blur of instructions, specific cleaning products for different surfaces, which rooms to tackle first, and strict rules about interaction with the family. Elena nodded along, trying to memorize everything. "Mr. Hart works from home most days," Mrs. Peterson explained as they walked through the massive kitchen. "He values his privacy above all else. If you see him, a simple 'good morning' or 'good afternoon' will suffice." Elena followed Mrs. Peterson through the winding hallways, taking in the pristine marble floors and expensive artwork. The house was beautiful, but felt empty somehow, like a museum rather than a home. Starting in the east wing, Elena worked methodically, dusting and polishing as she'd been instructed. Her mind wandered as she cleaned, thinking about all the homes she'd worked in over the years. Each one had been another chance to search, another possibility that had led nowhere. By mid-morning, she reached the main living room. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the elegant space. Elena moved carefully around the antique furniture, working her way around the room with practiced efficiency. As she dusted a side table, something caught her eye. There, above the grand fireplace, hung a large portrait in an ornate gold frame. Elena's dusting cloth slipped from her fingers, landing soundlessly on the plush carpet. The portrait showed a man she assumed was Jonathan Hart, his expression serious but kind, with dark hair touched by gray at the temples. But it was the young girl beside him that made Elena's heart stop. The child, who looked about 12, had familiar warm brown eyes and a smile that Elena saw in her dreams every night. Elena's legs felt weak. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself, her eyes fixed on the girl's face. The same heart-shaped face, the same dimple in her right cheek. Features Elena had memorized in photographs she'd carried with her for years. "Sophia," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But the nameplate beneath the portrait read, "Jonathan and Sophie Hart." Elena's hand shook as she pulled out her phone, fumbling to open her photos. There it was, the last picture she had of her daughter, taken just days before the flood that had torn their lives apart. Sophia, 7 years old, beaming at the camera with missing front teeth. She held up the phone, comparing the images. The same eyes, the same smile, just older now. Elena's vision blurred with tears as she stared at the portrait, years of searching and hoping crashing over her like a wave. Could it really be her Sophia? After all this time, could fate have led her here? Elena's mind raced with questions as she tried to steady her breathing. She needed to be careful, to be sure. She couldn't risk losing this chance if she was right. The sound of footsteps in the hallway snapped Elena back to reality. She quickly wiped her eyes and retrieved her fallen dusting cloth, trying to compose herself. But her gaze kept returning to the portrait, to the face of the girl who might be her long-lost daughter. Elena's hands trembled as memories of that terrible night flooded back. The rain had been relentless, pounding against their small house near the river. She could still hear the warning sirens, their haunting wail cutting through the darkness. "Mama, I'm scared," Sophia had whispered, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit. They'd tried to evacuate in time, joining the stream of frightened neighbors in their cars. But the waters had risen too quickly. Elena remembered the horrible moment when their car stalled, the engine sputtering as muddy water crept up the doors. "Hold my hand tight, mi amor," she had told Sophia as they abandoned the car, trying to reach higher ground on foot. The memory of Sophia's small hand slipping from hers made Elena's chest tighten. One moment, they were together, fighting through the rushing water. The next, a surge had swept them apart. Elena's desperate screams had been lost in the roar of the flood and the howling wind. She'd searched for days, weeks, months. The local authorities had done their best, but as time passed, hope began to fade for everyone except Elena. She'd refused to give up, moving from town to town, following every lead, working as a housekeeper to support her endless search. Now, standing in Jonathan Hart's elegant living room, Elena studied the portrait again. Sophie Hart had the same warm brown eyes as her Sophia, the same gentle curve of her cheeks. But doubt crept in, mixing with her hope. What if she was wrong? What if her desperate wish to find her daughter was making her see things that weren't there? Elena touched the silver locket around her neck, the one containing Sophia's school picture. She'd kept it close to her heart all these years, a constant reminder of her purpose. Could her search finally be over? "Miss Ruiz?" The deep voice startled her. Elena turned to find Jonathan Hart standing in the doorway, his tall frame casting a shadow across the polished floor. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, his presence commanding but not unkind. "Mr. Hart," Elena said quickly, straightening her uniform, "I apologize. I was just—" Admiring the portrait? His expression was unreadable, but his tone held no anger. "Yes, sir. It's beautiful." Elena forced herself to meet his gaze, trying to keep her voice steady. "Your daughter has such a lovely smile." Something softened in Jonathan's eyes at the mention of Sophie. "Thank you. That was painted last year for her 12th birthday." He moved further into the room, his shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. "Mrs. Peterson tells me you've been doing excellent work this week." "I try my best, sir." Elena's heart was racing, but years of practice helped her maintain a professional demeanor. Jonathan nodded, glancing around the immaculate room. "I can see that. The place hasn't looked this good in quite some time." He paused, studying her with careful consideration. "You have attention to detail, Ms. Ruiz. That's something I value highly." "Thank you, Mr. Hart." Elena clutched her cleaning cloth, aware of how close she was standing to the man who might be raising her daughter. "Keep up the good work," he said, offering a small but genuine smile. "And please, let Mrs. Peterson know if you need anything." His expression grew warmer as he added, "We take care of people who take care of us here." The staff kitchen was quiet during the afternoon lull, sunlight streaming through the small window above the sink, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Elena sat at the break table, Her lunch barely touched as her mind wandered to the portrait in the living room, the image of those familiar eyes haunting her thoughts. "You should eat something," a friendly voice said. "The days are long here, and you'll need your strength." Elena looked up to see Maria Torres, one of the longtime kitchen staff, settling into the chair across from her. The older woman's kind face creased with concern as she unwrapped her own sandwich, the aroma of fresh bread filling the small space between them. "I'm just a little distracted," Elena admitted, picking up her fork and pushing the food around her plate. Maria nodded knowingly, her gray-streaked hair catching the sunlight. First week in a new place is always hard. But Mr. Hart is a good employer. Stern sometimes, but fair. He takes care of his people. Elena hesitated, then carefully asked, "How long have you worked here, Maria?" "Going on 8 years now." Maria's eyes softened with remembrance. "I was here when he brought Sophie home. Such a tiny thing she was, all big eyes and tangled hair." Elena's heart skipped a beat. "Brought her home?" "Oh yes, she's adopted." Maria lowered her voice, though they were alone in the kitchen sanctuary. "It was during that terrible flood. Must be 7 years ago now. Mr. Hart found her somehow. Never got the whole story. But he fell in love with that child right away. Went through all the proper channels to adopt her when no one claimed her. Spent months making sure everything was legal and proper." Elena's hands trembled beneath the table, and she clasped them tightly together to steady herself. 7 years ago. The same flood. The timing matched perfectly, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. "She must have been very young," Elena said carefully, fighting to keep her voice steady. 5, maybe 6. Maria took a bite of her sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. Poor thing couldn't remember much about before. But Mr. Hart gave her everything. The best schools, music lessons, all the love a father could give. He built his whole world around her, changed his entire life to be there for her. Elena nodded, struggling to keep her expression neutral as her mind raced with possibilities. The age was right. The timing was right. And those eyes in the portrait, they were Sophia's eyes, the same ones that had looked up at her with trust and love so many years ago. "It's wonderful that he took her in," Elena managed to say, her throat tight with emotion. "Oh, it changed him completely. Before Sophie, he was all business, all the time. Now—" Maria smiled, her face glowing with affection. "Now he leaves work early for her dance recitals, takes her for ice cream every Sunday, helps with homework every night without fail. She brought out his heart, made him human again." Throughout the afternoon, Elena went through her cleaning routine mechanically, her thoughts churning like a stormy sea. Every detail Maria had shared seemed to confirm her hopes, but fear held her back from taking action, weighing heavy on her shoulders like a physical burden. What if she was wrong? She could lose her job, her only connection to Sophie. And if she was right, what then? Jonathan Hart clearly adored his daughter. He had resources, power, stability. What could Elena offer in comparison, except a mother's love and years of emptiness? Standing in the upstairs hallway, Elena paused near Sophie's bedroom door, her hand hovering over the polished wooden handle. Cheerful artwork decorated the walls. Watercolor paintings signed in a child's careful hand, each one preserved in a perfect frame. A shelf held trophies from dance competitions and academic achievements, gleaming in the afternoon light. This was a happy child's room, filled with love and security, every detail speaking of care and attention. Elena's hand went to her locket, touching it through her uniform, feeling its familiar shape against her fingers. Inside was the truth, a photograph that could change everything, that could shatter this carefully constructed piece. But as she thought of Maria's words about Jonathan's devotion to Sophie, Doubt crept in like a shadow. Would revealing the truth help or harm the child she loved so much? She stepped back from the door, her determination mixing with uncertainty like oil and water. She needed proof, something more concrete than her memories and hopes. Something that would convince Jonathan to listen, to understand. But how could she investigate without risking everything she'd worked so hard to achieve? For now, Elena decided, she would watch and wait, gathering information like precious gems. She would find a way to learn more about Sophie's past, about the circumstances of her adoption. There had to be records, documents, something that would help her build her case carefully before approaching Jonathan with the truth that could change all their lives. But every day of waiting would feel like an eternity, knowing her daughter might be so close, separated by nothing more than walls and silence, and the weight of unspoken truths. Elena was dusting the library shelves when she heard light footsteps behind her. She turned to find a young girl standing in the doorway, her dark curls framing a bright, curious face. "Hi, I'm Sophie," the girl said, stepping into the room with confidence. "Are you the new maid Dad hired?" Elena's heart raced at finally being so close to the child she'd been observing from afar. "Yes, I'm Elena. It's very nice to meet you, Sophie." Sophie walked over to the shelves, running her fingers along the book spines. "Do you like to read? These are all my favorites." She pulled out a well-worn copy of The Secret Garden. "I love that book," Elena said softly, fighting to keep her voice steady. "It's about finding hope in unexpected places." Sophie's face lit up. "That's exactly why I love it. Mary starts out so lonely, but then she discovers the garden and makes friends." She hugged the book to her chest. "What other books do you like?" Elena moved to the next shelf, maintaining a careful distance despite wanting to embrace the child. "I enjoy stories about brave girls who go on adventures, like A Wrinkle in Time." "Oh, I just finished that one last week." Sophie settled into a nearby armchair, tucking her feet under her. "Did you know I'm in the school reading club? We meet every Thursday." As they discussed their favorite characters and scenes, Elena noticed how Sophie used her hands while talking, just like Sophia had done. The same animated expressions, the same little laugh. "What about hobbies?" Sophie asked. "Besides reading, I mean. I take dance classes and love to paint." "I enjoy gardening," Elena replied, remembering how she used to teach Sophia the names of flowers. "And I like to make jewelry." "Really? That's so cool." Sophie jumped up from the chair. "I have this really special bracelet. Want to see it?" Before Elena could respond, Sophie was already racing out of the library. She returned moments later, something clutched in her hand. "Look!" Sophie held out her wrist, and Elena's world stopped. There, catching the afternoon light, was a delicate silver charm bracelet with tiny butterflies and a heart-shaped locket. Elena had spent months saving for it, had given it to Sophia on her 5th birthday, just weeks before the flood. "It's my lucky bracelet," Sophie explained, touching one of the butterflies. "Dad says it was with me when he found me, but I don't remember where it came from. Isn't it pretty?" Elena stared at the bracelet, memories flooding back. Sophia's delighted face when she opened the gift, the way she'd worn it every day, promising never to take it off. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, then pulled back. "Yes," she whispered, her vision blurring with unshed tears. "It's beautiful." Sophie beamed, unaware of Elena's emotional turmoil. "The heart opens too, but it's empty inside. Sometimes I make up stories about where it came from, like maybe it belonged to a princess or something." Elena turned back to the shelves, pretending to adjust books while she composed herself. That empty locket had once held a tiny photo of the two of them, smiling at the camera during a day at the park. The picture must have been lost in the floodwaters, But the bracelet had somehow stayed with her daughter through it all. "Elena? Are you okay?" Sophie's voice was concerned. "Just a bit of dust," Elena managed, wiping her eyes. "These shelves need a good cleaning." Elena moved quietly through Jonathan's study, her cleaning supplies balanced carefully in one arm. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, highlighting dust motes in the air that danced like tiny stars in the golden light. She had saved this room for last, knowing Jonathan would be away at meetings all morning, giving her the solitude she needed to work without interruption. The study was immaculate, with dark wood furniture and leather-bound books lining built-in shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. Family photos dotted the desk and walls, most featuring Jonathan and Sophie at various ages, birthdays, holidays, and casual moments that spoke of their close bond. Elena's heart ached each time she saw them together, a bittersweet pain that had grown sharper since she'd discovered the truth about the bracelet. As she wiped down the large mahogany desk, her cloth caught on something behind a stack of papers. Elena steadied the papers with gentle fingers and reached around them, finding a silver frame that had been partially hidden beneath the pile of documents. The photo inside made her hands shake so badly she had to set it down on the polished desktop. There, captured in the frame, were 3 people: Jonathan, a much younger Sophie, and a woman who could have been Elena's twin. The woman had the same dark waves cascading past her shoulders, the same gentle smile that dimpled one cheek, even the same slight tilt to her head that Elena saw whenever she looked in the mirror. "It can't be," she whispered, sinking into Jonathan's plush leather desk chair, her legs suddenly too weak to hold her. The photo appeared to have been taken at a park on what must have been a perfect summer day. The woman wore a cornflower blue sundress that fluttered in a captured breeze and had her arms wrapped around Sophie, who couldn't have been more than 4 years old, her dark curls in tiny pigtails. Jonathan stood beside them, looking younger and more relaxed than Elena had ever seen him, his smile wide and unguarded. Elena's mind raced, thoughts tumbling over each other like leaves in a storm. She had assumed Jonathan had simply found Sophie during the flood and taken her in out of kindness. But this photo suggested something else entirely, something that made her pulse quicken. The woman in the picture, had Jonathan known her? Known Elena? The implications made her dizzy. She studied the image more closely, noting details she hadn't seen at first glance. The park looked familiar. It was the same one where Elena used to take Sophia to play, where they'd spent countless happy afternoons. In the background, she could make out the distinctive red slide that had been Sophia's favorite, the one her daughter had called her rocket ship to the moon. Her hands trembled as she set the frame back on the desk, the glass catching the sunlight. All this time she'd been careful around Jonathan, watching her words, worried about revealing too much. But what if he already knew? What if he'd recognized her the moment she applied for the job? Had seen the same resemblance she now saw staring back at her from the photograph? The sound of footsteps in the hallway made Elena jump, her heart leaping into her throat. She quickly replaced the frame behind the stack of papers and grabbed her cleaning supplies, nearly knocking over the bottle of furniture polish in her haste. As she hurried to straighten the desk, her mind whirled with questions that demanded answers. Why would Jonathan have a photo of someone who looked exactly like her? Why had he never mentioned it, never given any indication that he recognized her face? And most importantly, what did he know about the day of the flood that had torn her world apart? The footsteps passed by without entering the study, but Elena's heart continued to race, pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked around the room with new eyes, wondering what other secrets might be hidden in plain sight. The careful way Jonathan had always watched her interactions with Sophie, his initial reluctance to let her work in certain areas of the house, his odd moments of hesitation when she asked about Sophie's past. It all took on new meaning, like puzzle pieces slowly shifting into place. She gathered her cleaning supplies with shaking hands, nearly dropping the feather duster. The photo changed everything. Jonathan wasn't just a wealthy man who had adopted a lost child. He was someone who might hold the key to the past she'd been trying to piece together for years. Someone who might know far more than he'd ever let on. Elena stood in Jonathan's study, her heart pounding as she waited for him to return from his evening business calls. The setting sun cast long shadows across the room, and she nervously twisted her hands together. After discovering the photo, she knew she couldn't keep quiet any longer. The door opened and Jonathan walked in, his tie loosened after a long day. He stopped short when he saw her. "Elena? Is everything all right?"
"Mr. Hart," she began, her voice trembling, "there's something I need to discuss with you."
Jonathan set his briefcase down and gestured to one of the leather chairs. "Please, sit." Elena shook her head. "I prefer to stand." She took a deep breath. "I saw the photo, sir. The one of you, Sophie, and the woman who looks like me." Jonathan's expression shifted, a mix of recognition and concern crossing his face. He moved to sit behind his desk, his movements deliberately slow. "I see." "That's not all," Elena continued. "I lost my daughter in the flood 7 years ago. Her name was Sophia." Her voice cracked. "She was wearing a silver bracelet with little butterflies on it, the same one Sophie showed me last week." Jonathan's face paled. He gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white. "Elena." "Please," she interrupted, tears forming in her eyes. "I need to know. Did you find her during the flood? Is Sophie my Sophia?" The silence that filled the room was deafening. Jonathan's shoulders slumped, and for the first time since Elena had known him, his carefully maintained composure crumbled. "Yes," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I found her clinging to a tree branch during the flood. She was so small, so scared." He ran a hand over his face. "I searched for weeks afterward, trying to find her family. I put up posters, contacted shelters and hospitals, but there was so much chaos. So many people had been displaced." Elena pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to contain a sob. "She couldn't remember much," Jonathan continued. "Just her first name and fragments of memories. When no one came forward after 6 months, I adopted her." His eyes met Elena's, filled with a mix of guilt and desperation. "I gave her everything I could, a home, an education, love. I wanted to protect her." "And the woman in the photo?" Elena asked quietly. "Sophie's babysitter from when she was younger," Jonathan replied, his voice heavy. "She left the country years ago. I kept the photo because—" He hesitated. "Because Sophie looked so happy that day." Elena leaned against the wall for support, overwhelmed by the confirmation of her suspicions. All these years of searching, and her daughter had been here, loved and cared for by this man. "I never stopped looking for her," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've carried her picture with me every day since the flood." Jonathan stood up, his movements unsteady. "I should have tried harder to find you. I convinced myself that after so much time had passed, it was better to give Sophie stability, to not disrupt her life." His voice broke. "I was wrong. I'm so sorry, Elena." The weight of 7 years of separation, of loss and longing, filled the space between them. Elena could see the genuine remorse in Jonathan's eyes, could hear the pain in his voice. This man had saved her daughter, had given her a life full of love and security. But he had also unknowingly kept them apart. Jonathan sank back into his chair, the weight of his confession hanging heavy in the air. His usually confident demeanor had given way to something more vulnerable, more raw. The setting sun cast long shadows across his office, highlighting the strain etched across his face. "I was just 17 when my parents left," he began, his voice quiet but steady. "No note, no explanation, just an empty house and unpaid bills." He absently straightened a pen on his desk, a habit Elena had noticed when he was deep in thought. The simple action seemed to ground him as he revisited painful memories. "I worked 3 jobs to keep the house, studied whenever I could find time." His eyes grew distant with the memories, focused on something far beyond the wood-paneled walls of his office. The hardest part wasn't the work or the loneliness. It was not knowing why they left, whether I had done something wrong. That question haunted me every single day. Elena sat down in one of the leather chairs, her own pain momentarily forgotten as she watched this powerful man reveal his hidden wounds. Her heart ached for the abandoned teenager he had once been. "That's why I threw myself into business," Jonathan continued, his fingers drumming softly against the polished desk. "I needed to prove something, to them, to myself, to the world. Every success felt like a shield I could hide behind." He gave a hollow laugh that echoed in the quiet room. "By the time I found Sophie, I had everything money could buy, but nothing that really mattered. I was just going through the motions, building bigger walls around myself." He stood up and walked to the window, watching the last rays of sunlight fade from the sky. The city lights were beginning to twinkle in the growing darkness. When I saw her that day, clutching that tree branch in the floodwaters, I knew I couldn't let her go through what I did. I couldn't let her feel abandoned again. Something inside me just clicked into place. Elena's voice was gentle when she spoke. "You saved her life." Jonathan turned back to face her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And now I realize that in trying to protect her, I kept her from you, a mother who never stopped searching." He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture betraying his inner turmoil. "I've been so afraid of losing her that I couldn't see the bigger picture. I became exactly what I feared, someone who kept the truth hidden." "We both want what's best for Sophie," Elena said, standing up. Her shoes made soft impressions in the plush carpet as she moved closer. "She needs both of us in her life." Jonathan nodded slowly, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "She's smart and sensitive. We'll need to be careful about how we tell her. This will change everything she thinks she knows about herself." "Perhaps we could start slowly," Elena suggested, her voice warm with hope. "Let her get to know me better first, build trust. Then when the time is right—" "We'll tell her together," Jonathan finished. He walked back to his desk and sat down, his posture more relaxed now. The defensive wall he'd maintained for so long was finally beginning to crumble. "We'll need a plan, a gentle way to introduce the truth. She has a right to know her history, but we need to protect her heart in the process." Elena felt tears welling up again, but this time they were tears of hope. The warmth of possibility spread through her chest. "Thank you, Jonathan, for everything, for saving her, for giving her a good life, and for being willing to share her now." "We'll make this work," Jonathan said firmly, his businesslike tone returning, but softer now, tempered with newfound understanding. "For Sophie's sake, we'll find a way to be a family, however unconventional it might be." They spent the next hour outlining a careful approach, agreeing to take things one step at a time. The ticking of the antique clock on the wall marked their progress as they crafted their plan. They would start by having Elena spend more time with Sophie, sharing carefully chosen stories from the past, and gradually preparing the ground for the truth to emerge. As they finalized their plan, Jonathan extended his hand across the desk, his expression both serious and hopeful. "Partners in this?" Elena took his hand and squeezed it gently, feeling the strength and sincerity in his grip. "Partners." Elena watched Sophie arrange her collection of books on the window seat, each volume placed with careful consideration. The afternoon sun caught Sophie's dark hair, highlighting the same subtle auburn tints that Elena remembered in her own daughter's hair. "These are my absolute favorites," Sophie explained, patting the stack. "Dad always says I'd read the dictionary if I ran out of books." Elena smiled, settling onto the cushioned seat beside her. "I used to read to children all the time when I was younger." She caught herself just in time. "Do you remember anyone reading to you before Jonathan adopted you?" Sophie's brow furrowed slightly as she traced the spine of a worn copy of The Secret Garden. "Sometimes I think I do, but it's all fuzzy, like trying to remember a dream." She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. "Dad says I was really little when he found me." "What's the earliest thing you can remember clearly?" Elena asked, keeping her voice casual despite her racing heart. Sophie was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant. "Water," she said finally. "Lots of water, and being scared." She shivered slightly, and Elena resisted the urge to pull her close. "But then Dad was there, and everything was okay." "That must have been frightening," Elena said softly. "Do you remember anything? Anyone else from before that?" Sophie picked up another book, fidgeting with its pages. "Sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I think I remember someone singing to me in Spanish. A woman's voice." She looked up at Elena. "Did you know my birth mother might have been Hispanic? Dad says he thinks so because of how I look." Elena's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirt. "That would make sense. Do you ever wonder about her?" "Sometimes," Sophie admitted. "Especially when I see other kids with their moms at school." She hugged the book to her chest. "I have this weird memory, or maybe it's just something I made up, of someone putting a bracelet on my wrist. A silver one with little stars." Her voice grew softer. "And I remember feeling really loved." Elena blinked back tears, remembering the moment she'd clasped that very bracelet around her daughter's tiny wrist. "That sounds like a beautiful memory," she managed to say. "Dad says my birth mother probably loved me very much, but something happened that separated us." Sophie's eyes grew thoughtful. "Sometimes I dream about her. In my dreams, she has long dark hair and warm hands, and she smells like vanilla." She glanced at Elena. "Is that silly?" "Not at all," Elena whispered, her throat tight with emotion. "Dreams can hold on to memories our minds have forgotten." Sophie nodded, then reached for another book. "I know I'm really lucky, though. Dad's the best. And now," she smiled shyly at Elena, "I have you to talk to, too. It's nice having someone else who loves books as much as I do." Elena took a deep breath, steadying herself. Despite the storm of emotions inside her, she knew she had to maintain composure. She watched as Sophie continued organizing her books, noting how her daughter's determined focus mirrored her own. The truth would come in time, she reminded herself. For now, these precious moments of connection were enough. "Would you like to hear one of my favorite stories?" Sophie asked, holding up a well-loved volume. Elena nodded, grateful for the distraction from her tumultuous thoughts. As Sophie began to read aloud, Elena listened to her daughter's voice, each word both a gift and a reminder of all the stories they had yet to share. Jonathan sat in Michael Crane's well-appointed office, his fingers drumming nervously on the leather armrest of his chair. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows, highlighting the worry lines on his face. "So let me get this straight. Michael said, leaning back in his chair. Sophie's biological mother has been working as your housekeeper for the past month? He shook his head in disbelief. And you're certain it's her? Without a doubt, Jonathan replied, running a hand through his hair. Elena has proof, photos, documents, even the matching bracelet Sophie still keeps. The resemblance is undeniable. Michael stood up and walked to his desk, pulling out a thick folder. I have all the adoption paperwork here from when you found Sophie during the flood. Everything was done properly, John. We posted notices, contacted authorities, searched for her family for months. I know, Mike. I remember every day of that search. Jonathan's voice grew quiet. But we never imagined her mother would end up right here, in my home. Michael flipped through the papers, his expression serious. Legally, you're still Sophie's father. The adoption is ironclad, but... He paused, looking at his old friend. This isn't just about legal rights, is it? No, Jonathan admitted. It's about what's best for Sophie. She's already starting to bond with Elena, even without knowing the truth. But she's 13, Mike. She's at such a sensitive age. Michael sat back down, folding his hands on his desk. Have you considered the psychological impact this could have on her? Finding out that her biological mother has been right under her nose, that the woman she's been sharing her thoughts and feelings with is actually her mother. That's exactly why I need your advice, Jonathan said. Elena and I agreed to tell her together, but we're struggling with how and when. John, Michael's voice took on a gentler tone, I've known Sophie since you brought her home. She's a sensitive child. This revelation could shake her entire world. Her trust in you, her sense of identity. Everything she believes about her life story would change in an instant. Jonathan nodded, his face etched with concern. But doesn't she deserve to know the truth? Of course she does, Michael replied. But timing is crucial. A revelation like this could traumatize her if not handled extremely carefully. She might feel betrayed, confused, angry. She might question everything and everyone around her. She's already asking questions about her past, Jonathan said. Just yesterday, she told Elena about memories she has of someone singing to her in Spanish. Michael leaned forward, his expression grave. That's exactly my point, John. These fragments of memory are one thing, but learning the full truth, that her biological mother has been right there, that you've known about it, it could emotionally devastate her. We need to approach this with extreme caution. Jonathan stood up and walked to the window, watching the city traffic below. I never thought I'd be in this position, Mike. When I found her during that flood, all I wanted was to keep her safe. Now I'm afraid the truth might hurt her more than any flood ever could. That's why we need to be very careful about how we proceed, Michael said, his voice firm but compassionate. Sophie's emotional well-being has to be our primary concern. Sophie walked down the hallway toward her father's study, her math textbook tucked under her arm. She needed help with her geometry homework, and Jonathan always made time for her after dinner, no matter how busy he was with work. As she approached the partially open door, the warm light spilling into the hallway, she heard voices, her father's and Elena's, speaking in hushed but intense tones. We can't keep this from her forever, Elena was saying, her voice trembling slightly. Sophie deserves to know the truth about who she... Jonathan cut her off, his chair creaking as he shifted. I know, but we have to be careful. The flood changed everything, and if we tell her wrong... Sophie froze, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The flood? She had vague memories of water and chaos, of rain beating against windows and terrified screams. But Jonathan rarely spoke about the day he'd found her. She pressed herself against the wall beside the door, the cool paint against her palm, straining to hear more. She's been having memories, Elena continued, her footsteps pacing across the wooden floor. The Spanish lullabies, the bracelet, it's all coming back to her. What if she figures it out on her own? Sophie's hand instinctively went to the silver bracelet on her wrist, the one she'd had since before Jonathan adopted her. The metal felt warm against her skin, familiar yet mysterious. Her mind raced with questions, each one more confusing than the last. What were they hiding from her? I just need more time, Jonathan pleaded, his voice heavy with emotion, to find the right way to explain everything without... Sophie's textbook slipped from her trembling grasp, hitting the hardwood floor with a loud thud that seemed to echo through the entire house. The voices inside the study immediately fell silent. She quickly scooped up her book, her cheeks burning with embarrassment, and hurried away, her thoughts whirling like autumn leaves in a storm. Later that evening, Sophie sat at the kitchen counter, pushing her chicken and vegetables around her plate with disinterest. The conversation she'd overheard played over and over in her mind, like a broken record. Elena worked quietly nearby, loading the dishwasher with practiced efficiency, and Sophie watched her with new eyes. There was something about Elena's features that seemed suddenly familiar, like a half-remembered dream from long ago. When Jonathan came into the kitchen for his after-dinner coffee, his newspaper tucked under his arm as usual, Sophie couldn't hold back anymore. "Dad," she said, her voice stronger than she felt, "we need to talk." Jonathan paused, coffee mug halfway to his lips, his eyes meeting hers with concern. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "I heard you and Elena talking earlier," Sophie said. Elena stopped loading the dishwasher, her back stiffening like a startled deer. "About the flood. About secrets. About me." Jonathan carefully set down his mug, the ceramic making a soft clink against the counter. "Sophie, what aren't you telling me?" Sophie's voice cracked like thin ice. "I know there's something. I can feel it. Every time I mention my memories from before, you change the subject. Every time I ask about my birth parents, you get this look on your face, like you're carrying something heavy." "It's complicated, Sophie," Jonathan said, reaching for her hand across the counter. Sophie pulled away, her chair scraping backward. "That's what adults always say when they don't want to tell the truth." Tears welled up in her eyes, making the kitchen lights blur and dance. "I'm not a little kid anymore. I deserve to know who I am." Jonathan glanced at Elena, who had turned to face them, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You're right," he said slowly, weighing each word. "You do deserve the truth, but it's not as simple as—" "Then make it simple." Sophie stood up, her chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that matched her frustration. "Why were you talking about my bracelet? Why did Elena mention Spanish lullabies? Why do I sometimes remember things that don't make sense with what you've told me?" Jonathan's face was torn with emotion, lines of worry creasing his forehead. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, clearly struggling with what to say, like a man trying to cross a river on stepping stones that kept shifting beneath his feet. "Please," Sophie whispered, her anger giving way to pleading, her shoulders slumping. "Just tell me the truth." Jonathan reached out again, and this time Sophie let him take her hand, his warm fingers wrapping around hers like they had countless times before. "Sophie, I love you more than anything in this world. Everything I've ever done has been to protect you." "From what?" Sophie asked, tears now rolling down her cheeks like summer rain. Jonathan squeezed her hand, his own voice thick with emotion. "From pain, from confusion, from losing everything you've known." He paused, looking more lost than Sophie had ever seen him. I need you to trust me a little longer. Please." Elena sat in the staff break room, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of chamomile tea, watching the wisps of steam curl into the air. Maria Torres settled into the creaky wooden chair across from her, concern etched on her kind face. The morning sunlight filtered through the small window, casting a warm glow across the worn table between them, highlighting the scratches and water rings from years of use.
"I don't know what to do anymore, Maria,"
Elena said softly, her voice barely above a whisper.
"Sophie was so upset last night. The look in her eyes."
She trailed off, remembering her daughter's tears and the way Sophie's hands had trembled with emotion. Maria reached across the table and squeezed Elena's hand, her weathered fingers warm and reassuring. "Tell me everything, mi amiga, every detail." Elena took a shaky breath and recounted the previous evening's events. Sophie confronting Jonathan, the pain and confusion in her voice, and the way Elena had stood frozen in the doorway, unable to step forward and reveal herself as Sophie's mother. Her tea grew cold as she spoke, forgotten in her distress.
"I feel like I'm failing her all over again," Elena whispered, twisting a paper napkin between her fingers. "First during the flood, and now by keeping silent when she's clearly hurting."
Maria listened intently, her dark eyes full of compassion, occasionally nodding as Elena spoke. "Elena, you're not failing anyone. This situation was delicate, like trying to repot a flowering plant. Move too quickly and you damage the roots. Sometimes the gentlest approach is the best one."
"But she's my daughter," Elena protested, her voice cracking. "Every time I see her hurting, my heart breaks. It's like physical pain."
"Yes, she's your daughter," Maria agreed, stirring her own tea thoughtfully, the spoon clinking softly against the ceramic. "But she's also Jonathan's daughter now. For 12 years, he's been her father. That bond is real, too. It's grown deep and strong, like an old oak tree." Elena nodded slowly, absently wiping her fingers across the rim of her cup. "I know. I see how much they love each other. That's partly why this is so hard. I don't want to destroy what they have." "Listen to me," Maria said, leaning forward, her chair creaking beneath her. "You have every right to fight for your daughter, but fighting doesn't always mean charging ahead. Sometimes it means stepping back, being patient, letting things unfold naturally, like watching a flower bloom till you can't force it open. What if she hates me when she finds out?" Elena's voice trembled, and she wrapped her arms around herself. "What if she thinks I abandoned her?" Maria shook her head firmly, her silver-streaked hair catching the sunlight. "That girl has your heart, Elena. I've watched you two together. The way you connect, how natural it feels. Give her time to process things. Let Jonathan help prepare her for the truth. He knows her better than anyone." Elena wiped away a tear with the back of her hand. "He's been good to her. I can see that now. At first, I was angry that he kept her from me, but he didn't know how to find you," Maria finished gently, her voice warm with understanding. "And he gave her a loving home when she needed one most. He protected her, raised her, loved her as his own." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the distant sounds of the household staff beginning their daily routines floating through the door, the soft swish of mops on tile, the gentle clatter of dishes, quiet conversations in the hallway. "You know what I think?" Maria said finally, adjusting her position in the chair. "I think Sophie needs both of you. But right now, she needs to hear this from Jonathan first. He's her rock, her safe place. Let him lead the way." Elena felt something settle in her chest. Not exactly peace, but acceptance, like a weight shifting into a more manageable position. "You're right. Pushing too hard could make things worse." She managed a small smile, the first genuine one that morning. "When did you get so wise, Maria?" "Wisdom comes from watching other people's telenovelas," Maria joked, her eyes twinkling as she lightened the mood.
But seriously, Elena, you're stronger than you know. And so is Sophie. Trust in that strength. It runs in the family. Helena nodded, feeling more centered than she had since Sophie's confrontation. She would step back, give Jonathan space to handle this his way. For Sophie's sake, she could be patient a little longer. The morning light grew stronger, warming her shoulders, like a gentle embrace. "Thank you, Maria," she said softly, genuine gratitude in her voice, "for everything." Jonathan drove his silver Mercedes along the winding coastal road, stealing glances at Sophie in the passenger seat. The morning sun sparkled off the ocean, and a gentle breeze carried the salt air through their open windows. He had chosen this spot deliberately, the same beach where he'd first taken Sophie for ice cream 12 years ago, just weeks after finding her. "Remember this place?" he asked, pulling into the small parking lot overlooking the shore. Sophie's face lit up with recognition. "The ice cream shop. We used to come here all the time when I was little." She turned to him, her eyes bright. "You always let me get 2 scoops, even though Amanda used to say it was too much sugar." Jonathan's heart tightened at the mention of his late wife, but he managed a warm smile. "That's right. And you always chose mint chocolate chip and Rocky Road," they said in unison, laughing. They walked down to the weathered wooden bench facing the ocean, each holding a towering ice cream cone, just like old times. Jonathan watched as Sophie licked her ice cream, noting how grown up she looked now at 15, yet still seeing traces of that little girl he'd rescued. "Dad?" Sophie's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Is everything okay? You've been acting kind of strange lately." Jonathan took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about family lately, about what it means to be a parent." Sophie lowered her ice cream cone. "Is this about what I overheard? Between you and Elena?" "Partly," Jonathan admitted. "Sophie, there's something I need to tell you about the day I found you, about your past." A seagull swooped down near them, and Sophie tossed it a piece of her cone. "I remember some things, about the flood. Sometimes I dream about it, the water, the fear." She paused, her voice growing quieter. "And sometimes I dream about a woman. She's singing to me in Spanish." Jonathan's hands trembled slightly. "What else do you remember?" "It's all fuzzy," Sophie said, frowning. "But lately, since Elena started working for us..." She trailed off, looking out at the waves. "What about Elena?" Jonathan prompted gently. "I don't know. Something about her feels familiar, like déjà vu, but stronger." Sophie turned to face him, her ice cream forgotten. "Dad, why did you really bring me here today?" Jonathan saw the worry in her eyes, the same expression she'd worn as a small child during thunderstorms. He reached out and took her hand. "Because this place holds special memories for us. Because no matter what happens or what we learn about the past, nothing can change how much I love you." Sophie squeezed his hand, but her brow remained furrowed. "You're scaring me a little. What aren't you telling me?" "I'm not trying to scare you, sweetheart. Jonathan struggled to find the right words. "I want you to know that family isn't always simple. Sometimes it's complicated and messy, but that doesn't make it any less real or precious." Sophie pulled her hand away slowly, studying his face. "Dad, there's something big you're not telling me, isn't there? Something about where I came from?" Jonathan felt the weight of her gaze, saw the mix of fear and determination in her eyes, so like Elena's. He opened his mouth to respond, but Sophie stood up suddenly, wrapping her arms around herself. "I need to walk for a bit," she said quietly. "Alone, if that's okay?" Jonathan nodded, watching as she walked along the shoreline, her shoulders tense. He could see her mind working, processing his words, perhaps putting together pieces of a puzzle she didn't fully understand yet. His attempt to prepare her had only seemed to increase her suspicions, and he wondered if he'd made the right choice in bringing her here today. Elena's hands trembled uncontrollably as she held the worn manila envelope. The letter had arrived that morning from the Flood Relief Agency, responding to her desperate inquiry from weeks ago. She sat at her small kitchen table, warm morning light streaming through her window and casting dancing shadows across the scratched wooden surface as she carefully, reverently unfolded the crisp paper. Her eyes frantically scanned the official letterhead, heart thundering against her ribs as she read, "Dear Ms. Ruiz, after reviewing our extensive records from the flood of 2011, we can confirm that a child matching your daughter's description was found in the affected area of Pine Grove. DNA samples were collected from all unidentified children during rescue operations, as per standard protocol. Based on the genetic analysis you recently submitted, we can verify with 99.9% certainty that Sophie Hart is your biological daughter, Sophia Ruiz." Elena pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, hot tears blurring her vision as the weight of the words sank in. The letter continued with technical details and contact information, but those words, 99.9% certainty, kept jumping off the page, burning themselves into her mind. Here finally was the irrefutable proof she'd been desperately searching for all these years. She stood up abruptly, pacing her small apartment like a caged animal, the precious letter clutched tightly to her chest. Memories flooded back in overwhelming waves, Sophia's first wobbly steps across this very floor, her favorite bedtime lullaby about little stars, the delicate silver bracelet she'd saved for months to give her for her 3rd birthday. The same bracelet she'd spotted on Sophie's slender wrist, glinting in the sunlight like a beacon of hope. The phone on her kitchen counter seemed to mock her with its presence. One simple call to Sophie could change everything in an instant. The truth was right here in stark black and white, undeniable scientific proof that Sophie was her beloved Sophia. Helena sank back into her chair, legs weak, spreading the letter reverently on the table before her. Jonathan's cautioning words echoed persistently in her mind. We need to be careful about this. Sophie's whole world could come crashing down if we don't handle this right. She traced her finger slowly over the agency's embossed official seal, feeling every ridge and valley. They had agreed, she and Jonathan, to work together as a team, to break the earth-shattering news gently and gradually. Jonathan had been diligently trying to prepare Sophie, taking her to meaningful places from their shared past, carefully opening conversations about family and identity. But now, holding this definitive letter, Elena felt a fierce, almost overwhelming urgency burning in her chest. 15 long, agonizing years she'd searched for her daughter. 15 years of empty holidays and birthdays, of lying awake wondering if Sophia was safe, loved, alive. The answer had been so tantalizingly close. Just across town in a beautiful house with a man who'd managed to give her daughter everything Elena couldn't. She pulled out her phone with shaking fingers, scrolling to Sophie's number. The girl had eagerly insisted on exchanging numbers after their animated conversations about favorite books. One simple text could change everything forever. Sophie was remarkably perceptive. She'd already sensed something was different about their connection. Maybe she even suspected the incredible truth. Elena's thumb hovered uncertainly over the bright screen. Then she remembered Sophie's troubled face just yesterday. How lost and vulnerable she'd looked walking along the windswept beach after her heavy conversation with Jonathan. The deep confusion clouding her eyes, the visible tension knotting her young shoulders. She was already struggling to process the subtle hints of truth Jonathan had carefully tried to share. With a deep, steadying breath,
Elena folded the letter precisely and slipped it back into its protective envelope. She walked slowly to her bedroom and opened her cherished jewelry box, the one special place she kept her most precious possessions. Inside was a slightly faded photo of Sophia on her 3rd birthday, beaming at the camera with chocolate cake on her chin, the last picture taken before the devastating flood. Elena placed the envelope reverently beside it and closed the lid with a soft click. The proof could wait a little longer. Sophie needed time and space to process what Jonathan was gently trying to tell her. Elena had somehow survived 15 years of uncertainty. She could force herself to wait a little longer to ensure her daughter's emotional well-being came first. But as she stared at the closed jewelry box, Elena felt the tremendous weight of the truth pressing down on her like a physical force. The letter changed everything and nothing all at once. Sophie was her daughter. She had always known it with unshakable certainty in her mother's heart. Now she just had to make the agonizing decision whether to wait for Jonathan's careful, measured approach or to share this concrete evidence with Sophie immediately, potentially shattering the only world the girl had ever known. Jonathan stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, watching the sun rise over the city skyline. The golden light caught the edges of the buildings he owned, a testament to decades of hard work and determination. His reflection in the glass showed a man who had come far from the scared teenager sleeping in homeless shelters. Graying temples now framed a face weathered by years of difficult decisions and relentless drive. He remembered those early days, the constant hunger, the shame of wearing donated clothes, the ache of abandonment. His parents had left him with nothing but a crumpled note saying they couldn't handle it anymore. At 16, he'd learned to survive on his own, taking any job he could find, from cleaning bathrooms to stocking shelves in the early morning hours. His first break came from a kindly restaurant owner who saw potential in the quiet, hard-working boy. Jonathan started as a dishwasher, but quickly learned every aspect of the business, staying late to study the books and asking endless questions about management. By 25, he had saved enough to buy his first struggling restaurant, living in the tiny apartment above it to save money. Within 5 years, he owned a chain of successful establishments across the city. But success felt hollow. The penthouse apartment, the expensive cars, the growing business empire, none of it filled the emptiness inside. He'd find himself sitting alone in his massive living room, surrounded by designer furniture that held no warmth. Until that rainy night during the flood, when he found a terrified little girl clinging to a tree branch, her pajamas soaked through and her dark hair plastered to her face. Jonathan closed his eyes, remembering Sophie's tiny hand in his, as rescue workers searched unsuccessfully for her family. Her trust in him had been immediate and complete, her small body curling into his protective embrace at the shelter. When no one claimed her after weeks of searching, he couldn't bear the thought of her ending up in the system like he had, bouncing between foster homes and temporary caregivers. The adoption process had given his wealth meaning. Every dollar spent creating a safe, loving home for Sophie felt like an investment in something real, something precious. Her presence transformed his house into a home. Her laughter filling spaces he hadn't known were empty. Her artwork brightening sterile walls with splashes of crayon color and glitter. He turned from the window and picked up a framed photo from his desk, Sophie's first day of school. Her gap-toothed smile and bright eyes made his chest tighten with love and pride. She wore a bright yellow backpack, almost as big as she was, her dark braids tied with matching ribbons. She had brought light and purpose into his life. Every business decision, every investment had been made with her future in mind, creating a legacy of security she would never have to question. But now, watching her struggle with questions about her identity, Jonathan felt the weight of his choices pressing down on his shoulders. He had searched for her family, yes, but perhaps not hard enough. The fear of losing her had influenced his efforts, made him too quick to accept dead ends, too relieved when leads grew cold. Each passing year had made it easier to convince himself that silence was protection. Elena's appearance had forced him to confront these uncomfortable truths. Her presence in their lives, with her gentle ways and obvious love for Sophie, had shattered his carefully maintained illusion. Sophie deserved to know her biological mother, deserved the chance to understand where she came from. His own childhood had taught him the pain of unanswered questions about family, the hollow ache of not knowing why you weren't wanted. Jonathan set the photo down and sank into his leather chair, the expensive leather creaking under his weight. The thought of sharing Sophie made his stomach churn with anxiety, but keeping the truth from her any longer felt selfish and wrong. He had raised her to be honest, to face challenges with courage and integrity. Now he needed to follow those same principles, no matter how difficult the path ahead might be. "I have to tell her," he whispered to the empty office, his voice rough with emotion. "Today." The decision settled over him like a heavy blanket, both comforting and constraining. He would lose something precious, the simple father-daughter relationship they'd always shared, built on bedtime stories and Saturday morning pancakes. But Sophie would gain something invaluable, the truth about her past and the love of two parents instead of one. Perhaps, he realized with a glimmer of hope, they could build something new together, something even stronger. Jonathan reached for his phone to call Sophie, his fingers hovering over the smooth screen. His hand trembled slightly as he scrolled to her number, past the smiling photo she'd set as her contact picture. She deserved to know everything, even if it meant risking the precious bond they shared. It was time to put her needs above his fears, to trust that the love they shared was strong enough to weather any storm. Sophie tossed and turned in her bed, tangled in silk sheets that felt suffocating against her clammy skin. In her dreams, water rushed around her, dark and threatening, swirling with debris and chaos. But there was something else. A woman's voice calling out desperately, "Sophia, mi amor!" The sound echoed through her mind, familiar yet strange, like a half-remembered lullaby from long ago. She jolted awake, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The digital clock on her nightstand showed 3:47 a.m., its red numbers harsh in the darkness. This was the third night in a row she'd had similar dreams, each more intense than the last. Each time, they felt more vivid, more real, leaving her with an ache she couldn't explain. The woman's voice lingered in her mind, stirring something deep within her memories, like ripples disturbing still water. Sophie pushed herself up and walked to her bathroom on shaky legs, splashing cold water on her face until she felt more grounded. The reflection in the mirror showed dark circles under her eyes, making her look older than her 14 years. She touched the silver bracelet on her wrist, the one she'd shown Elena, running her fingers over its smooth surface. Something about it felt significant, like a key to a door she couldn't find, but she couldn't quite grasp why. Throughout the day, fragments of the dream kept interrupting her thoughts, appearing at random moments like camera flashes. During breakfast, Jonathan noticed her distraction as she pushed her scrambled eggs around the plate, but didn't press when she claimed she was just tired. At school, she found herself doodling waves and water in her notebook instead of taking notes, the blue ink spreading across the pages like the flood in her dreams. That afternoon, Sophie wandered into the library, where Elena was dusting shelves, her movements graceful and purposeful. The familiar scent of leather-bound books and furniture polish usually brought comfort, but today even this sanctuary felt different, charged with unspoken questions. Elena's gentle humming stopped when she noticed Sophie's troubled expression, her dark eyes filling with concern. "Is everything all right, Carino?" Elena asked, setting down her feather duster and brushing dust from her apron. Sophie sank into one of the plush armchairs, letting herself be swallowed by its softness. "I've been having these dreams," she said, twisting the bracelet around her wrist in a nervous gesture she'd developed lately. "They feel like memories, but they're all mixed up and confusing, like a photo album dropped in water." Elena sat in the chair opposite her, her movements careful and measured, as if approaching a frightened animal. "Dreams can be like that sometimes, mixing truth and imagination. Would you like to talk about them?" "There's water everywhere," Sophie began, her voice quiet and uncertain. "And a woman calling out to someone named Sophia. She sounds so scared, so desperate, like her whole world is falling apart." She looked up at Elena, searching her face. "The strange thing is, her voice feels familiar, like something I used to know but forgot, like a favorite song you can't quite remember." Elena's hands clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles whitening, but her face remained calm and encouraging. "That must be very unsettling for you, mi amor." "It is." Sophie pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself small in the large chair, a habit from childhood. "And lately, I keep noticing things, like how Dad gets nervous when I ask about my birth parents, changing the subject, or suddenly remembering important phone calls, or how some of my earliest memories don't quite make sense, like pieces from different puzzles forced together." Elena moved to perch on the arm of Sophie's chair, offering silent support. Sophie leaned slightly into her presence, finding comfort in the familiar scent of lavender that always seemed to surround Elena, like a warm embrace. "Sometimes," Sophie continued, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve, "I wonder if I'm going crazy. These feelings and memories, they're like puzzle pieces that don't fit together." Her voice cracked slightly, betraying her inner turmoil. "I love Dad more than anything, but I can't shake the feeling that there's something important I should remember, something just out of reach." Elena gently stroked Sophie's hair, her touch maternal and soothing, each movement filled with unspoken emotion. "You're not crazy, Michello. Sometimes our minds need time to process things, especially memories from when we were very young. They're like shy butterflies, hard to catch if you chase them." Sophie looked up at Elena, tears glistening in her eyes like morning dew. "Why does it hurt so much to try to remember?" Elena pulled her into a gentle hug, careful to maintain her composure despite her own emotional turmoil that threatened to spill over. "Some memories are like delicate flowers, Sophie. They need time and gentle care to bloom. Don't force them. They'll come when they're ready, when the soil is right and the sun is warm." Sophie relaxed into the embrace, drawing comfort from Elena's steady presence and the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. The afternoon sun streamed through the library windows, casting warm patterns on the carpet like nature's stained glass. And for a moment, the confusion in Sophie's mind settled into a peaceful quiet, like the calm after a storm. Jonathan paced in his study, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. The morning sun cast long shadows through the windows, and his hand trembled as he held Elena's old letter. They had agreed this was the right time. Sophie needed to know the truth. He found Sophie in the garden, sitting on her favorite bench near the rose bushes, reading a book. The sight of her there, so peaceful and unaware of how her world was about to change, made his heart ache. "Sophie, sweetheart," he called softly, "can we talk?" She looked up, marking her place with a bookmark. "Sure, Dad. Is everything okay? You look worried." Jonathan sat beside her, the letter feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds in his pocket. "There's something important I need to tell you. Something I should have told you long ago." Sophie's expression grew serious. Is this about my dreams? About the flood?
Yes,
Jonathan nodded, his throat tight. It's about your past. And about Elena.
Elena?
Sophie's brow furrowed. What does she have to do with my past? Jonathan took a deep breath. During the flood, when I found you, I searched for your family. I put out notices, contacted authorities, did everything I could. He paused, gathering courage. But I didn't find them then. The truth is, Sophie, Elena is your biological mother. Sophie's face went pale. She stood up abruptly, the book falling from her lap onto the ground. What? Her name was Elena Ruiz then, and you were Sofia Ruiz. The flood separated you both, and she's been searching for you ever since.
No,
Sophie shook her head, backing away.
No, that's not possible. You're my father. You're my family.
I am your father, Sophie. Nothing will ever change that. Jonathan reached for her hand, but she pulled away. But Elena is your biological mother, and she's been carrying this pain for years.
Pain,
Sophie's voice rose.
What about my pain?
You've been lying to me this whole time. Both of you have. Her eyes filled with angry tears. That's why she took this job, isn't it? To get close to me. She recognized you from the family portrait, Jonathan explained. She wasn't sure at first, but when she saw your bracelet...
The bracelet.
Sophie looked down at her wrist, suddenly understanding.
That's why she reacted that way when she saw it.
She yanked it off and threw it onto the bench.
How long have you known? Sophie, please.
How long? She demanded. Jonathan's shoulders sagged.
A few weeks.
We wanted to find the right way to tell you.
Weeks.
Sophie's voice cracked.
You've both been pretending everything was normal, playing some kind of game with me.
She wrapped her arms around herself, tears streaming down her face.
I trusted you. I trusted both of you.
We were trying to protect you, Jonathan said, his own voice breaking. We wanted to be sure, to handle it carefully. Handle me, you mean? Sophie cut him off. Like I'm some delicate thing that can't handle the truth. Her face contorted with hurt and betrayal. All these years, you let me wonder about my birth parents. You watched me struggle with those memories, and you said nothing.
I'm sorry,
Jonathan whispered.
I'm so sorry, sweetheart.
Don't. Sophie held up her hand.
Just don't.
She turned away, her shoulders shaking.
I can't. I can't even look at you right now.
With that, she ran toward the house, leaving Jonathan alone in the garden. The bracelet lay glinting in the sunlight on the bench, a symbol of all the truths he'd kept hidden for so long. Sophie burst into the kitchen where Elena was preparing lunch, her eyes red and puffy from crying, her school backpack still clutched tightly in one hand. Why didn't you come for me? She demanded, her voice trembling with emotion, raw and accusatory. Elena dropped the dish towel she was holding, startled by Sophie's sudden appearance, her heart hammering against her ribs. Sophie, All these years, Sophie continued, her words tumbling out in a rush of anger and pain, her free hand gesturing wildly. Where were you? Why didn't you find me? Elena's hands shook as she gripped the kitchen counter for support, her knuckles turning white from the pressure.
I never stopped looking for you, Sophie, not for a single day.
Don't call me Sophia. Sophie's voice cracked like thin ice. That's not my name anymore, and looking isn't good enough. You were supposed to find me. Her shoulders heaved with each ragged breath. Elena took a tentative step forward, but Sophie backed away, bumping against the doorframe. The flood came so fast, Elena began, tears welling in her eyes, threatening to spill over. The water was everywhere. I was holding your hand so tight, but the current... She pressed her trembling hand to her mouth, fighting back a sob that threatened to tear her apart.
It tore you away from me." "I don't remember much about that day," Sophie admitted, her anger wavering slightly, her fingers unconsciously playing with the zipper of her backpack. "Just water and screaming." "I screamed your name until I lost my voice," Elena continued, her voice thick with emotion, each word carrying the weight of years of grief. "I searched through every shelter, every hospital. I put up posters everywhere. I called every authority I could think of." She wiped her eyes with trembling fingers, smudging away the tears. "For years, I traveled to different cities, following any lead I could find. I took jobs as a housekeeper because it let me move around, keep searching." Sophie's shoulders slumped slightly, the fire of her anger dimming. "But you never found me." "The authorities told me you probably didn't survive." Elena's voice broke, splintering like glass. "But I wouldn't believe it. I kept searching. I had to believe you were out there somewhere, being cared for by someone kind." "Jonathan," Sophie whispered, the name coming out like a prayer. Elena nodded, a sad smile touching her lips. "When I saw your picture here, saw your bracelet, my heart knew, but I was so afraid of disrupting your life, of hurting you." "It hurts now," Sophie said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier bite, softening around the edges. "I know, mi amor." Elena's use of the Spanish endearment made Sophie's eyes widen, recognition flickering across her face. A distant memory stirred, of being called that same name, of feeling safe and loved, wrapped in warm arms on cool nights. "I used to sing to you," Elena said softly, her voice carrying the melody of remembrance. "Every night before bed. Estrellita, ¿dónde estás?" "Little star, where are you?" Sophie translated automatically, then caught her breath in surprise, one hand flying to her throat. I remember that. I thought it was just a dream." Elena took another careful step forward, and this time Sophie didn't back away, rooted to the spot by the weight of memory. "I never stopped being your mother, Sophie. Not for one single day. Even when I thought I'd lost you forever. I carried you in my heart." Tears spilled down Sophie's cheeks, leaving glistening trails. "I was so angry when I found out you both kept this from me. But you really never stopped looking?" "Never," Elena confirmed, her voice steady despite her tears. "Ask Maria. She's seen all the missing person reports I still keep, all the newspaper clippings about the flood. I've traced every lead, followed every possibility. Finding you here, it's the miracle I've prayed for every day for 12 years." Sophie's anger seemed to deflate like a balloon, replaced by a confused mix of emotions that played across her face. "I don't know how to feel about all this. It's too much." "I understand," Elena said gently, her voice warm and patient. "You don't have to figure it out all at once. We have time now. All the time in the world." Jonathan sat at his kitchen table early one morning, his coffee growing cold as he and Elena discussed how to move forward. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished wood, highlighting the worry lines on both their faces. A half-eaten bagel sat forgotten on his plate, evidence of his distracted state of mind. "She barely spoke to me at dinner last night," Jonathan said, running a hand through his graying hair. "I've never seen her this withdrawn. She just pushed her food around the plate and asked to be excused early." Elena nodded sympathetically, wrapping her hands around her own untouched mug of tea. "It's a lot for her to process. She needs time, but she also needs to know we're both here for her. We can't rush this." "I thought about enrolling her in counseling," Jonathan suggested, his voice tinged with concern. "Someone professional who can help her sort through her feelings. I know a few good therapists who specialize in family situations." "That's a good idea," Elena agreed, leaning forward. "And maybe we could start doing some activities together, all three of us. Something casual and comfortable? Jonathan's expression softened, a glimmer of hope crossing his face. Sophie always loved our weekend cooking sessions. Maybe we could start there. It's familiar ground for her. That Saturday, Jonathan and Elena worked side by side in the kitchen, preparing Sophie's favorite pasta dish. The rich aroma of garlic and herbs filled the air as sauce simmered on the stovetop. When Sophie came downstairs, drawn by the familiar scents, she hesitated in the doorway, her fingers nervously playing with the hem of her sweater. "Would you like to help?" Elena asked gently, offering a warm smile. "Your father tells me you make excellent garlic bread. He says it's the best he's ever tasted." Sophie looked between them, her expression uncertain, shoulders tense. After a moment, she stepped into the kitchen and quietly began gathering ingredients for the bread, moving with the familiarity of someone who knew this kitchen by heart. As they worked, Jonathan shared stories about Sophie's first attempts at cooking, his eyes crinkling with fond memories. "Remember when you were 10 and you tried to make breakfast in bed for my birthday? You were so determined to do it all by yourself." A small smile tugged at Sophie's lips, the first they'd seen in days. "I set off the smoke alarm. Mrs. Peterson next door thought the house was on fire." "But you didn't give up," Jonathan continued, pride evident in his voice. "You kept trying until you got it right. That's always been one of your strongest qualities." Elena watched their interaction, adding her own memories carefully, her voice soft and tentative. "You were always determined, even as a tiny girl. When you were 4, you insisted on tying your own shoes. You sat there for an hour, your little tongue sticking out in concentration. Nothing could distract you." Sophie's hand stilled on the bread dough, her eyes distant with memory. "I remember someone teaching me a rhyme about bunny ears for tying laces. I used to repeat it every time. 'The bunny runs around the tree and through the hole,'" Elena said softly, her voice catching slightly on the words. Sophie's eyes widened in recognition, her fingers trembling slightly against the counter. "That was you. I remember your voice." The three worked together, moving around each other in the kitchen, finding a careful rhythm. Jonathan noticed how Sophie watched Elena's familiar movements, the way she hummed while stirring the sauce, how she automatically reached for spices without having to search for them, the same way Sophie had always done. "You both," Sophie began, then paused, gathering her courage. "You both really love me, don't you? Even with everything that's happened?" Jonathan set down the plate he was holding, turning to face his daughter fully. "More than anything in this world, sweetheart. That's never changed, and it never will." "I searched for you every day," Elena said tearfully, "and your father kept you safe and loved. We both wanted what was best." Sophie studied them both, Jonathan, her rescuer who'd given her a loving home, and Elena, who'd never stopped searching. She fidgeted as she collected her thoughts. "I found these," Sophie said, producing worn missing person flyers with her childhood photo from her pocket. "Maria said you carried them always, that you never gave up." A tear rolled down Elena's cheek. "I couldn't give up, Hope. Not with you." "And Dad," Sophie turned to Jonathan, "I found your diary from after you rescued me, about my nightmares, the doctors, helping me feel safe." Jonathan squeezed her hand gently. "You were so brave. Still are. I just wanted to stop your hurt." Sophie looked at her hands, one in Jonathan's, one holding Elena's flyers. She realized love could be complex, but doubly powerful. The moment hung between them, as rich as the simmering sauce and warm as the rising bread. Sophie sat in her bedroom, surrounded by photo albums spread across her floral bedspread. Each page showed moments with Jonathan, birthdays, holidays, school events,
all capturing their life together. Her fingers traced the edges of a photo where Jonathan held her on his shoulders at a carnival, both of them grinning widely.
"He's always been there,"
she whispered to herself, feeling the familiar ache in her chest. The thought of hurting him by spending time with Elena made her stomach twist. A gentle knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Sophie, may I come in?" Jonathan's voice was soft, caring.
"Yes, Dad."
Jonathan entered, his eyes taking in the scattered albums. He sat carefully on the edge of her bed, looking at old memories. Sophie nodded, picking up a photo of them building a snowman. "Remember this? You let me use your favorite scarf for the snowman, and then it got ruined when the snow melted." "And I wasn't even mad," Jonathan smiled, "because you were so proud of that snowman." Sophie's eyes welled with tears. "I don't want to hurt you, Dad, but I keep thinking about Elena, about all the memories I don't have, about my other family." Jonathan reached out and took her hand. "Sweetheart, wanting to know about your biological family doesn't diminish what we have. Elena is part of who you are." "But what if—" Sophie's voice cracked. "What if spending time with her makes you feel like you're not enough? Because you are enough, Dad. You've always been enough." "Oh, Sophie," Jonathan pulled her into a hug. "My love for you isn't fragile. It won't break because you want to know your mother. In fact," he pulled back to look her in the eyes, "I think you should spend some time with Elena. She has so many stories to share about your early years, about your grandparents, about where you came from." Sophie wiped her eyes. "Really? You wouldn't mind?" "Not at all. Your heart is big enough for both of us." Later that afternoon, Sophie found Elena in the garden, tending to the roses. She watched for a moment as Elena worked, noting how her movements seemed familiar somehow, like a half-remembered dream. "Elena?" Sophie's voice was quiet, but determined. Elena looked up, her face brightening. "Sophie, would you like to join me? These roses could use some attention." Sophie knelt beside her in the soft grass. "I'd like that. And I was wondering if maybe you could tell me about my grandparents while we work. And about what I was like as a baby?" Elena's hand stilled on the rosebush, her eyes glistening. "I'd love nothing more. Your grandmother, she made the most amazing churros. She used to sing to you in Spanish while she cooked." As Elena shared stories, Sophie felt something settle in her heart. She could love them both, Jonathan, who had saved her and raised her with unwavering devotion, and Elena, who carried the other half of her story. It wasn't betrayal, it was completion. "Would you like to come with me to the market tomorrow?" Elena asked. "I could show you how to pick ripe mangoes, just like your grandmother taught me." Sophie smiled, feeling the weight of guilt lifting from her shoulders. "I'd really like that. Maybe we could make some of her churros together sometime, too." "Of course, mi amor." Elena's voice was thick with emotion. "Anytime you want." Jonathan sat in his study, watching through the window as Elena and Sophie worked together in the garden. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over them both, highlighting their matching smiles and shared mannerisms. He found himself noticing things about Elena he hadn't before. The grace in her movements, the gentle way she guided Sophie's hands through the soil, the musical sound of her laughter carrying through the glass. He leaned back in his leather chair, surprised by the warmth spreading through his chest. For weeks, he'd seen Elena primarily as Sophie's biological mother, a figure who had unexpectedly entered their lives. But now, watching her patient interactions with their daughter, he recognized something more. "She's remarkable," he murmured to himself, remembering how Elena had handled the revelation to Sophie with such care and understanding. Despite the years of pain and separation, she hadn't rushed in demanding immediate recognition. Instead, she'd shown wisdom and restraint, putting Sophie's emotional well-being first. Jonathan thought back to their early conversations when Elena had first confronted him about Sophie. Even then, facing the possibility of losing her job, she'd approached him with dignity and courage. No threats, no accusations, just an honest desire to know the truth about her daughter. Through the window, he watched as Elena showed Sophie how to properly prune the rose bushes. Her expertise extended beyond just cleaning the house. She seemed to bring life to everything she touched. The gardens had never looked better, and the house felt warmer somehow since she'd arrived. Rising from his chair, Jonathan walked to his desk and picked up a framed photo of Sophie's last birthday. Elena had helped organize the celebration, making traditional Mexican dishes alongside Sophie's favorite American foods. The joy on Sophie's face as she experienced both sides of her heritage had been worth every moment of uncertainty. Later that afternoon, Jonathan made his way to the kitchen where Elena was preparing dinner. He noticed her struggling with a heavy pot of water for pasta. "Let me help you with that," he said, stepping forward to lift it onto the stove. Elena looked surprised but grateful. "Thank you, Mr. Hart." "Please call me Jonathan," he said softly. "I think we're well past formalities." A slight blush colored Elena's cheeks as she nodded. "Jonathan, then. Thank you." He found himself lingering in the kitchen, watching as she chopped vegetables with practiced ease. "The garden looks beautiful," he commented. "Sophie seems to really enjoy learning from you." "She has a natural talent for it," Elena replied, her eyes bright with pride. "Just like my mother did." Jonathan moved to the cabinet, pulling out the expensive olive oil he usually reserved for special occasions. "Here, use this for the sauce. It'll bring out the flavors better." Elena's eyes widened at the gesture. "But that's your special olive oil." "And this is a special dinner," he said simply, placing the bottle beside her cutting board. "The first of many family meals together, I hope." The word family hung in the air between them, carrying new weight and meaning. Jonathan felt his heart skip a beat as Elena's warm smile lit up her entire face. "I should get some fresh herbs from the garden," Elena said, turning toward the door. "I'll come with you," Jonathan offered, holding the door open for her. As they walked together toward the herb garden, he realized how natural it felt to be in her company, how easily they had begun to move in sync with each other's rhythms. At the garden, he held the basket while Elena carefully selected the herbs she needed, finding himself admiring her knowledge and expertise. When she reached for a higher branch of rosemary, he steadied her elbow without thinking, the simple touch sending unexpected warmth through his hand. Sophie and Elena prepared a surprise dinner for Jonathan, filling the kitchen with aromatic herbs and garlic. Sophie chopped vegetables under Elena's guidance, calling her Mama, a term growing more natural daily. They moved efficiently through the kitchen as Elena made her grandmother's albondigas soup while Sophie set the table with their best china and garden flowers. When Jonathan's car pulled up, they dimmed the lights, leaving only the dining room's warm glow. Jonathan entered to find a transformed home, a beautifully set table, lit candles, and his family waiting. Sophie hugged him while Elena emerged wearing an apron, both proud of their surprise. During dinner, Elena served the soup as Sophie described her contributions. Elena shared the dish's heritage, weaving family traditions into their meal. The once quiet dinners had evolved into lively family gatherings. Watching Elena naturally tend to Sophie, who responded with complete trust, Jonathan realized Elena hadn't merely become Sophie's mother. She had fulfilled needs in their family he hadn't recognized. Her presence had brought vitality to their home, awakening its dormant potential.
Jonathan paced in his study, his fingers drumming against his thigh as he rehearsed the words in his mind for the 100th time. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. He'd asked Elena to meet him here before she started her duties for the day, and now his heart thundered in his chest as he waited. A gentle knock at the door made him freeze. "Come in," he called, his voice slightly hoarse. Elena entered wearing her usual neat uniform, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Hart." "Jonathan, please," he corrected softly. "And yes, I did. Would you sit down?" He gestured to one of the leather armchairs. Elena settled into the chair, her posture straight but tense. Jonathan remained standing, unable to keep still. "I've been wanting to talk to you about something," he began, then paused, running a hand through his hair. "These past few months since we've been working together for Sophie's sake, they've changed everything." Elena's expression remained carefully neutral, though her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Yes, they have." "I know our beginning was complicated," Jonathan continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I kept Sophie from you for years, even if I didn't know I was doing it. Sometimes I wonder if you resent me for that." "Jonathan," Elena started, but he held up a hand. "Please, let me finish. I need to say this." He took a deep breath. "I've developed feelings for you, Elena. Strong feelings. But I understand if you can't see past what happened before." Elena's eyes widened slightly, and Jonathan hurried on, the words tumbling out now. "I see how wonderful you are with Sophie, how patient you've been with this whole situation. Your grace and strength, they're remarkable. But I know asking for more might be too much." He finally stopped pacing and sat in the chair across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I had to tell you how I feel, even if you don't feel the same way, even if you can't forgive me for keeping Sophie from you all those years." Elena was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes studying his face. When she spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "I used to think about what I would do if I ever found the person who had my daughter. I imagined being angry, demanding justice." Jonathan's heart sank, but Elena wasn't finished. "But when I found out it was you, when I saw how much you loved Sophie, how you'd given her everything I couldn't." She shook her head, a small smile touching her lips. "How could I resent someone who loved my daughter so completely?" She reached out and placed her hand over his. "You protected her, raised her, gave her a beautiful life. Your love for Sophie isn't something I resent. It's something I admire deeply." The weight that had been pressing on Jonathan's chest began to lift. "Really? Really," Elena confirmed, her smile growing warmer. "These past months I've seen what kind of man you are. Kind, devoted, willing to put Sophie's needs before your own pride. Those aren't things to resent, Jonathan. They're things to treasure." Sophie watched Elena make breakfast while Jonathan read his paper. Their stolen glances at each other made her smile. "Dad," she said, making him lower his paper, "the garden needs work. Elena used to have a nice one. Maybe you could work on it together." They exchanged surprised looks as Elena focused on the pancakes, blushing. "Not a bad idea," Jonathan said. "It needs attention." "Perfect spots for roses," Elena said, serving Sophie. "Maybe vegetables by the south wall. Could we grow tomatoes and strawberries?" "Whatever you'd like," Jonathan said, watching them fondly. "A family project?" The word family lingered hopefully. Sophie grinned. "I'd love to help," she said. "But I have that science project. You two start without me." Jonathan noted her obvious matchmaking, but Elena's laugh made his pulse quicken. That evening, after Sophie's bedtime,
Jonathan and Elena sat in the garden. Spring air carried jasmine scents as they shared the bench under the oak, nearly touching. "Sophie's not subtle," Elena said. Jonathan laughed. "Gets that from me. Never could hide my feelings." They watched fireflies dance in the darkness. "It's incredible how she's embraced us both," Elena said. "I worried that she'd reject one of us. I feared that too. But Sophie's heart is boundless." Elena wiped away a tear. "She's perfect. Sometimes thinking of the missed years hurts. But she was with you, loved and safe." "Watching you two together shows me something," Jonathan said. "What?" "Sophie was meant for both of us. Perhaps this is how it should be. The three of us, finding each other." Elena caught her breath as fireflies danced and a nightingale sang nearby. Morning sunlight filtered through garden roses as Jonathan paced the stone path, repeatedly touching the velvet box in his pocket. The once neglected garden had become vibrant with flowers and vegetables, mirroring their transformed lives. Elena approached in a blue sundress, carrying a watering can. After she set it down, she smiled. "You're up early." Jonathan nervously ran his hand through his hair. "I wanted to catch you before Sophie wakes up." "Is everything all right?" "More than all right," he said, taking her hands. "Elena, watching you with Sophie, seeing our family come together, it's beyond my dreams." Elena squeezed his hands, eyes glistening. Finding Sophie in the flood seemed like saving her, but she saved me too. Then you came, making everything clear. He knelt, revealing the diamond ring. "Our story isn't conventional, but the best ones rarely are. Elena Ruiz, will you marry me? Help make our family complete?" Tears sparkling, Elena whispered, "Yes," then louder, "Yes, Jonathan Hart, I will." He placed the ring on her finger and embraced her as they laughed and cried together. "Mom, Dad?" Sophie appeared in her pajamas. "Did you just—" Elena displayed the ring. "Your father just proposed." Sophie squealed and rushed to hug them both. "I knew it! This is the best day ever!" Jonathan and Elena shared a loving look over their daughter's head. Elena's heart swelled. After years of searching and loneliness, she'd found her daughter an unexpected love. The ring caught the light, casting rainbows across their faces, a symbol of their bright future. Sophie burst into Elena's bedroom with fresh garden flowers on the wedding morning, her face bright as the streaming sunlight. "Mom, these are for your hair." She placed the white roses and forget-me-nots on the dresser. "Maria's bringing your dress soon." Elena sat at her vanity in her silk robe, dark hair loose around her shoulders. Her hands shook as she lifted her brush. Sophie took it. "Let me," she said, brushing her mother's hair. "Like you did for me before the flood." Elena met her eyes in the mirror. "Yes, mi amor. Every night." Maria entered with the garment bag, revealing an elegant ivory gown with lace details. "Perfect," Sophie whispered, pausing. Elena touched the lace. "I never thought I'd have this, with both of you here." "No crying," Maria laughed, pulling out makeup supplies. As Maria did Elena's makeup, Sophie wove flowers into her mother's hair. They shared stories and laughter. Down the hall, Jonathan struggled with his bow tie, watching sunlight stretch across his study floor. He reflected on finding Sophie in the flood, his fears of losing her, and how gaining Elena had strengthened their family. He studied their first family portrait on his desk, Sophie beaming between them on the garden bench, Elena radiant, his own face softened with joy. Michael Crane entered. "Still alive, I see." "Barely," Jonathan admitted. "Feels like a dream."
Michael fixed Jonathan's tie. You deserve this second chance. When you found Sophie, I thought you were crazy. But look at what you've built. Jonathan nodded, emotional. Never thought I'd have a real family. Michael smiled. The best families are the ones we build. The coordinator appeared. Mr. Hart, time for the altar. Jonathan straightened his jacket, grateful. Today marked the official start of their hard-won family. The Hart Mansion garden bloomed like an enchanted wonderland, with white roses and lilies perfuming the air. White chairs lined the stone path, where guests gathered for the ceremony. Jonathan waited at the altar, his heart racing. As the quartet played, Sophie emerged in pale blue, carrying white roses, radiant with joy. Then Elena appeared in an ivory lace gown, fresh flowers crowning her dark hair. Her eyes locked with Jonathan's as she walked forward, dissolving years of loneliness. Their simple ceremony held deep meaning. They exchanged heartfelt vows, hands trembling as they shared rings. After being pronounced married, the garden erupted in cheers. Sophie embraced them both, while guests wiped away tears. At the reception, as fairy lights sparkled at dusk, Sophie rose to speak. Though holding notes, she spoke from her heart. As a child, I dreamed of a complete family. Dad's love was everything, but something was missing. Mom, you filled that void perfectly. Your endless hope and love inspire me. Dad, you're my hero. Taking in a flood refugee, giving her a home and future, then finding Mom and putting my happiness first showed your true character. Watching your love story unfold has been miraculous. You've taught me family means love, sacrifice, and daily choice. I'm proud to be your daughter, both of yours. Sunlight streamed through the Hart Mansion's kitchen windows as the family shared breakfast. Elena moved through the kitchen while coffee and pancake aromas filled the air. Jonathan read his paper, glancing up to watch his wife and daughter contentedly. Sophie helped Elena cook, measuring and mixing as she'd been taught. The teen had grown closer to Elena lately through their shared love of cooking. These strawberries are perfect, Sophie said, slicing them. Like the ones your mother used for jam. Elena smiled warmly. She'd spend weekends making it. The house smelled sweet for days. Jonathan set his paper down. We should make jam together, though I only manage toast and coffee. That's why you need us, Sophie teased, nudging him as she passed. They shared breakfast and daily plans naturally, their previously separate lives now seamlessly joined. That afternoon, Elna worked in her new herb garden. Sophie brought lemonade for them both. I've been thinking about family, Sophie said as they sat on the garden bench. How good things can come from hard times. Elena listened intently as Sophie continued. The flood was awful, but it gave me 2 loving parents, Sophie said. I worried having 2 mothers would be strange, but it's not. Dad gave me stability when I needed it, and you never stopped searching for me. Elena squeezed Sophie's hand. I would have searched forever. I love you, Mom, Sophie said softly. Elena's heart soared at the words she'd long dreamed of hearing. They embraced tearfully, while Jonathan watched from the kitchen, moved by their emotional connection. Elena worked at her new downtown office for the Hart Family Reunion Foundation, the walls lined with photos of reunited flood survivors. Her computer displayed a database of people seeking lost loved ones. She reviewed aid applications when her assistant announced Mrs. Martinez's arrival. The weary woman entered with an old photo, sharing how her son was lost during evacuation. Elena promised help, understanding the pain firsthand. Jonathan brought lunch from Sophie later, finding Elena researching a promising lead on Mrs. Martinez's son at a shelter across state lines. He praised her work while helping organize files, discussing fundraising plans.
They'd reunited 3 families last month. When Sophie arrived to volunteer after school, she sat with a girl searching for her sister. Jonathan embraced Elena as they watched their daughter. "This is becoming a community," he observed. Sophie suggested hosting an event to unite searching families. Elena held her daughter close, surrounded by success stories that proved hope endures. The Hart Family Reunion Foundation's database crashed, wiping out hundreds of vital records. Elena stared at her screen in dismay. Before she could call Jonathan, Sophie rushed in wearing her backpack. "Mom, Dad's coming. I texted him when Mrs. Torres told me." Elena smiled despite her worry. "Thanks, sweetheart. Shouldn't you be in class?" "It's lunch period," Sophie said, moving to her mother's desk. "I remember Mrs. Martinez's details. We can start there while waiting for Dad." Jonathan arrived with his laptop. "Michael's sending his best IT specialist." He kissed Elena and squeezed Sophie's shoulder. "Let's see what we can salvage." They worked together, Sophie recalling file details, Elena reconstructing contacts, and Jonathan coordinating IT. The setback became a family project. "Remember the family with twins?" Sophie asked, checking her notebook. "I wrote their story down." "The Hendersons," Elena said, "looking for their aunt." Jonathan added it to their recovered data. "We need better backups. But look how far we've come." "From when you were just my dad, and I didn't know Mom was my real mother?" Sophie asked. Elena and Jonathan exchanged glances, amazed at Sophie's adaptation. "From when we were all separate," Elena said softly. "We're stronger together," Sophie declared, "like all the families we help." By afternoon, IT recovered most data, and they'd reconstructed the rest. Their crisis had showcased their unity. Jonathan hugged them both. "I'm so proud of us." "We never give up," Sophie said, holding their hands. "Always," Elena whispered. "We'll face everything together." Golden autumn light bathed the Hart mansion. In the family room, Elena prepared hot drinks and cookies while Jonathan tended the fire. Sophie sat on the carpet, browsing a photo album. "Look," Sophie said, indicating a photo of her younger self, tearful but resolute, between her parents. "From when you told me the truth." Elena joined Jonathan under a blanket. "I feared you wouldn't forgive us." "I was angry," Sophie said, "but now I understand. Dad protected me, and Mom never stopped looking." Jonathan sipped his cocoa. "When I hired Elena as housekeeper, I never imagined she'd transform our lives." Elena nestled close. "And I never knew that Portrait's little girl was my Sophia." "Being Sophie Hart Ruiz feels right," Sophie said, sitting between them. "Both parts of me united." They watched the fire in content silence. Elena recalled Sophie hiding behind curtains while she cleaned, drawn by an unknown familiarity. Jonathan remembered keeping his distance, fearing change. Sophie showed them her favorite photo, their wedding day, the 3 of them amid roses. "When we became official, though we were already family." "We've faced challenges," Jonathan said, hugging Sophie. "Together," she replied. Elena surveyed their home, once just her workplace. "Sometimes this feels like a dream." "It's real, Mom," Sophie said, leaning on her. They sat peacefully, the photo album chronicling their journey from separate lives to one united family. Jonathan expressed gratitude for their bond, and Elena clasped his hand across Sophie, completing their circle in the firelight. If you enjoyed the story of Elena Ruiz, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.